Now, I am thrilled to introduce our first panel and only panel for today, a panel on the economic opportunities and challenges of Indonesia's transition to the net zero carbon emissions. I would like to welcome our moderator for today, Meaghan See, the Director of Partnerships at EcoBusiness, to the stage to introduce our panel of speakers.
Okay. Thank you, Diane, for introducing this panel for today. I'm super honored to be here, to be moderating these very distinguished speakers that I'll be having on. I would like to introduce Ms. Lucita Jasmin, the Director of Sustainability and External Affairs for April Group, to be on here. Mr. Bayu Wirawan, the Managing Director and Chief Investment Officer of Indonesia Infrastructure Finance. Ms. Ratri Wakeling, the Director for Investments at Pollination. And finally, but not least, Jiro Tominaga, Country Director for the Asian Development Bank. Thank you all for being here and for everyone as well. I know it's been such a busy week with the Basketball World Cup and the ASEAN Week as well that's coming up this week, so thank you all for being here. Before I go on with the questions, I'm going to just set the context for the rest of the panel session that will be happening. And also if the events team can just check that the mic is not making any unnecessary sounds. All right, thank you. I'm just going to go through and set the key context for today's discussion. As you know, prefaced already by our two speakers from today, we do know that Indonesia's net zero goal of 2060 is a race, and there's a lot that needs to be done before we get there. There is a huge renewable energy potential as well in the country, a potential of about 342 gigawatts of renewable energy, which is about 5 times the annual current power generation amount there is in Indonesia right now. But in order to get there, an average of about US 150 billion to 250 billion of investment is needed every year until 2030 for Indonesia to reach net zero. And as of now, there's about 57% financing gap in this journey. So we know that a mix of public and private investments is needed for this decarbonization journey. So the key questions here, how to attract private investments into this space? How do we ensure that with this net zero transition, no one gets left behind, that we are protecting people's livelihoods as well? And what kind of partnerships are important to forge this net zero journey? I do not have the answers, but with all my very distinguished speakers up here, I'm sure we can get some useful insights from them today. But before I go on to the first questions for all my speakers, I would like to flash up this QR code that I would like to get everyone's answers on, actually. If the QR code can be flashed on. The question for everyone is, describe Indonesia's net zero journey in one word. And in just 5 seconds, the Slido should be up. There it is. So it's going to be a word cloud. It's going to be very interesting to see everyone's perspective on how we can describe Indonesia's net zero journey in one word. I think I give a maximum of 2 words for you to put up there. Complex. Anyone? 2 participants. I should be seeing at least 40 participants typing in this room. Complex, difficult. Anyone else? Okay. We'll just let this fill up for a little bit. Half-hearted. Okay. I'm going to also let the speakers comment on all this as well. But as we see the word cloud forming, I'm going to go on to my very first question for Lucita. We know that there is a net zero goal for Indonesia to reach 2060. And for April Group, we have set the net zero goal for 2030. Tell us more about the decision behind this and also how the group's going to achieve this. But maybe also you can comment on the word cloud behind you if you want to as well.
Sure. Thanks, Meaghan. Am I on? Thanks, Meaghan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. Thank you also for joining us this afternoon. And I look forward to an interesting conversation with the rest of the panelists. One word, I think, yes, that's the big word that we had in mind. It's going to be challenging, but of course, it's a great ambition. So it's really going to take a lot and a concerted effort from different stakeholders under the leadership of the government. I think it is really impressive what Dr. Gigi has just outlined for us today, which is to show that roadmap, right? And to show what can be achieved given certain conditions and given certain support from national and international stakeholders as well. And that is where we come in as the private sector. We do need to make and demonstrate the business case for decarbonization and to set the tone in terms of how we can contribute to the national and to the global climate ambitions. I think if you can just step back a bit, because you're asking about how we got to that decision, it'll be useful to set the context. At the start of the decade, in early 2020, we were all aware that there were two global imperatives that we needed to respond to. One is, of course, achieving the 2030 Development Agenda, otherwise known as the Sustainable Development Goals. And two is, of course, to keep global warming at below 1.5. Then it was still 2 degrees, adjusted to 1.5. And what that meant, what science was telling us, was that we needed to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030 and every decade thereafter until we get to net zero by 2050. Indonesia has set its NDC, and now, of course, it's been strengthened from 29 to 32% by 2030, with a higher ambition of 41% conditioned on international support. Closer to home, in April, in 2020, that was the 5th year of our sustainable forest management policy. We were largely on track in terms of implementation, but we knew we needed to do more. We needed to connect to the global agenda of keeping global warming below 1.5 while also contributing to the achievement of the SDGs. So we knew we needed to go beyond policy compliance and actually set a forward-looking agenda that contributes to this imperatives. And it doesn't mean, of course, that at that time we meant to abandon our sustainable forest management policy. We considered it as a foundation of our 2030 development, of our 2030 sustainability agenda. And in fact, within the company, we refer to it as an inviolable principle, something that we will continue to build on. So, why 2030? Why not 2050 or 2060 as Indonesia has for its net zero? We thought that 10-year time frame was just giving us the right balance between ambition and urgency. As a private sector, we were all about operationalizing, implementing some of these initiatives. And 10 years to still give us that just right runway to see how are we going to operationalize this within the operations, while at the same time, of course, also being able to achieve this at an ambitious level, right? So that was the reason for that time frame. What were the other considerations? I guess number one, while we were setting our climate ambition, we knew that we couldn't do it in isolation. It needed to be approached holistically, together with other dimensions that we knew had dependencies. We couldn't be talking about climate without addressing the twin crisis of nature loss. And we knew, of course, how one was exacerbating the other. And at the same time, I don't think we could talk about climate and nature without also addressing the need to still lift people out of poverty. Without actually addressing also the reality of needing to grow the business. Yeah. So we needed to make sure that whatever we set as a 2030 agenda would, of course, would necessarily address the climate ambition part of it, but at the same time also having the pillars of nature, inclusivity as far as people and economic development are concerned, and also continuing sustainable growth for the company. So that is why with the 2030 agenda, with the purpose of delivering a positive impact, going just beyond mitigating negative impact, but actually delivering positive impact. And this would be across climate, nature, people, and growth. So that's the background for you, Meaghan.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lucita. Like how you said, in terms of ensuring everyone's included as well, and people, nature, and growth as well. So with that, I'd like to go on to Mr. Bayu. We know that the private sector plays a huge part in this role, and IIF seeks to accelerate private sector participation with respect to infrastructure development in Indonesia. Tell us more about how IIF is promoting sustainable infrastructure development here.
Yeah, thank you.
And also if you want to comment on any of the words up there as well.
No, I think I have my own words. It's evolution. It is. I mean, Pak Gigi already describes 2022 until 2060. It's not revolution. It's not abruptly changed. It needs to be in what's it called? need way step by step until we can achieve that goals. But yeah, back to your questions, Meaghan. So we are actually the arms of the government of Indonesia. We partnering with several multilaterals. Jiro is actually one of my shareholders, as well as IFC, KfW, and SMBC, Sumitomo. So our mandate is actually to provide financing to infrastructure sectors, but we can only do it in a sustainable way. So if the question is what we have been doing in order for us to be able to achieve this initiative, is that we enforce or we ask our clients to develop the projects in a sustainable way. So they have to comply with environmental, sustainable governance as in the international standards. Now the question would be, is it difficult? Does our business model works? Surprisingly, it is. We've been established since 2010. Our first project was in 2012. And up until now, we have around 100+ projects, from toll roads, fiber optics, drinking water, seaport, airport, and all are developed in a sustainable way, meaning that we use the resources without endangering the needs of our future generations.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bayu. I think with that, you did mention how that you encourage or you require clients to develop projects in a sustainable way in line with local and also international standards. I wanted to go on to Ratri on this point because Pollination is that specialist climate change investment advisory firm. What are some key trends among clients with respect to its decarbonization goals? And how are they looking to mitigate their exposure to climate risks? And also, if you want to comment on the net zero journey in Indonesia, I'll provide your own word as well. That's very welcome.
Thanks, Meaghan. Thanks very much. And thanks for having me in this panel as well. So I think agree with large amount of those words that are out there, but putting my optimistic hat, I think Indonesia has the potential to lead. And in terms of your question, particularly in Indonesia, we're seeing that Indonesia is really taking a global step at the moment in leading a lot of the global events recently with the G20 and the ASEAN presidentship. I think that really sends a clear signal that Indonesia wants to lead in the region to solve what we say the twin challenges is, which is securing that economic growth while at the same time leading on the net zero transition as well. From companies' perspective, which are some of them are our clients or some of them are partners as well. What we're seeing is they're facing that they have to also solve those twin challenges. So how do they continue to become globally competitive in the current environment, but at the same time being and leading and capturing the opportunities to transition towards that low carbon economy? I think there's sort of two implications from that side. So one, from a business continuity perspective, the companies that we're working with are really looking to transition their core business and seeking new avenues and license to play in the low carbon economy, regardless of their existing businesses that they might have been in the last sort of 20, 30 years, and they can't ignore any more of those changing operating environments. Secondly, I think a lot of them are already seeing that the global capital is shifting. There are more and more pots of capital. They're very clearly looking to fund these transition opportunities, whether that's the energy transition side, industrial decarbonization across all the value chains, as well as looking to fund nature-based solutions, for example, at scale, in order to restore and give our ecosystem a fighting chance, basically.
Thank you so much, Ratri. I like what you said about them looking to see how they can also have that license to play in this low carbon economy. And with that, I'd like to go on to Jiro for this one. We know that ADB's 2020 to 2024 country partnership is meant to help Indonesia grow, to finance key renewable energy projects, support regulatory reforms, and also sustainable infrastructure investment as well. Tell us more about the significance of this partnership and how this partnership is helping Indonesia's net zero goals.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I'm also allowed to comment a little bit on the By the way, thank you very much for the invitation. Very much honored to be able to be part of this panel. I think many of the words described here, I think I very much agree with. But particularly, I would just take up the complex issues. I think Bagigi just talked about this roadmap, etc. It is really complex. And then complex in a sense because we want to do this in a country with a very dynamic economy, growing, and at the same time, talked about the energy access that we really want to give to every single person in Indonesia. Because the socio-economic impact of just having an access to energy, it's so large that from the development institution like ourselves, that is the sort of the value that we cannot ignore. So I think, but at the same time, you're kind of reducing the greenhouse gas emission. So really the challenge is that how can we decouple this potential sort of the trade-off between economic growth and greenhouse gas reduction? What is the economic system or the new kind of thinking paradigm that we can come up with collectively in a global sort of a community to decouple those two and then make sure that the economy grow as we reduce greenhouse gas emission? So I think that's really the challenge that we are given as a generation, in this generation, that it is the sort of the challenge that we have to tackle together. And then just going back to our work in this area from the ADB point of view, climate is really the corporate priority for us. We do recognize that it is really the critical challenge for our society right now. Not to be too dramatic, but I think it is really something that we may have to really work on it as our life depends on it, in a sense, because it might actually do, right, particularly for the generations after us. So I think that's really important. And then from that perspective, Asia and the Pacific is really important because more than half of the CO2 emission actually happens here. Yeah. And compared to the Europe and the US, I think Europe had about Central America, North and Central America and Europe together, they have about 16%. Yeah. So, and then in that sense, right, I mean, as the ADB, as a regional development bank, which works on this Asia Pacific region, this really sort of the value that we want to bring in to be relevant. And then we have committed to $100 billion sort of the financing from 2019 to 2030 on a balance sheet for the climate finance. Now, Indonesia specific, our country partnership strategy, we do look at, again, very much aligned to the corporate priorities as well as the government priorities for the journey to net zero. We're very much actively supporting the government in various areas. I think let me just quickly turn to 3 areas. One is, of course, in the energy side. We have the energy portfolio. We have very much long history of working with the energy sector here in Indonesia. About 46%, I believe, of our portfolio of the ongoing project are actually in the energy sector. And then we also have a very strong pipeline of energy sector support, including our support for just energy transition partnership, JETP, and then also the energy transition mechanism we may be able to speak later that involves both the renewable development as well as early retirement of coal-fired power plants. Yeah, so that we are working on, and then also the loans and also the policy-based loan, working with the government, PLN, Ministry of Energy, etc., Ministry of Finance to make this happen. Secondly, also, we are beyond energy, of course, particularly, for example, in the transport, we are working very actively to co-finance expansion of the Jakarta MRT expansion east-west, working together with the financiers like JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, to try to structure this project and work with the government. And thirdly, also about the transition has to be, probably there's going to be a discussion later, it has to be just and affordable. So in terms of helping people who may get the negative impact from the transition, to help them re-skills, retrain, and then also, to help them with in conserving and protecting their livelihoods and then the prosperity, path towards prosperity, education opportunity, etc. We are also working on that part partly, for example, from the energy education sector support in trying to sort of also develop in the sort of the science and technology side of the energy the education sector here in developing the renewable energy and then energy technology, battery technology, etc. We're helping that as well. So anyway, I mean, overall, and then also skills development for the for workers. So all in all, I think Indonesia for us in the country partnership strategy, this climate and net zero path is a big priority for us, and we would like to continue working very actively in this area.
For sustainability, I wanted to turn to Lucita for this because you did say earlier that it has to be a holistic approach as well, taking into account people and nature. So with April Group's net zero targets, can you elaborate on how this is going to happen for the company and how you intend to implement the strategy?
Thanks, Meaghan. I think this is building on what Jiro just said just now. We cannot be looking at this in terms of false dichotomies where we focus on the trade-offs. We need to see them in integration. And I think that's the key. If you're able to see them as a holistic approach to sustainable development where climate, nature, people, and growth are all part of it, then I guess we're able to feed off both on the dependencies, both in terms of impacts and also in terms of solutions. The way we do it is, of course, as mentioned, we have 4 commitment pillars, and under each of the pillars, across all 4 pillars, we have 18 targets. And some of our targets do demonstrate how one initiative feeds into the other. For example, we have a target for improving our productivity from our fiber plantations or forest plantations by 50% by 2030. And what this means is because we have a commitment to not convert any new area into plantation, any new forest into plantation. And this has been a commitment that our company has held since 2015. And in addition to this, of course, there is a commitment to increase investment in conservation and restoration. And what this means is, of course, it has impact on our net zero emissions from land use target. Right, so the commitment to conservation, the commitment to invest in restoration are all feeding into the climate and into the climate ambition, while also, of course, contributing to the ambition to protect more nature and to restore more forests in our areas. How does this happen? Well, number one, I think we have the unique target of allocating $1 for every ton of fiber supply that is delivered to the mill. And what this means is that we have a secured resource, funding resource for our conservation and restoration initiatives, whether this be for our own initiatives or for those that we do in partnerships. And $1 per ton may not sound, significant per se, but if you look at the volume of the fiber that goes into our manufacturing facilities on a yearly basis, we're actually talking of between $10 and $12 million a year. So when we launched this commitment since 2020, we have committed a total of about $47 million into conservation and restoration. So this is us actually ensuring that the production, or applying our principle that if you produce from the land, you got to invest back in the land. So that is one target that actually addresses all of these. On the subject of people, you cannot talk about reducing your greenhouse gas emissions from the landscape if you're not addressing for example, the matter or the reality of seasonal burning that happens for agricultural clearing. So how do you do that, right? So this is where the meaningful engagement of the community should come in. This is where the understanding of the motivations for such actions come in, right? So what we do is, of course, we partner with the communities. We build their capabilities. We provide them with alternative mechanisms to clear the land. We provide them with incentives in the form of social infrastructure so that they do not burn, and therefore that is their way of contributing to the climate ambition, while at the same time also still addressing their sustainable livelihood needs. So there are many such, another form of partnership with the communities, of course, encouraging them to keep natural forests standing as conservation areas. And we call this a community conservation partnership. It's a way of introducing the notion of payment for ecosystem services or incentivizing them for conservation that eventually will become a sustainable livelihood source for them. So this is a way of addressing how do you encourage inclusive progress while at the same time also, again, looking at helping companies to achieve their climate ambitions within the landscape. So basically what we've done is really come up with targets that address the integration of all these objectives within our 2030 agenda.
Thank you so much, Lucita. That's very enlightening as to how much the group is doing as well with respect to making sure it's inclusive and equitable transition. I wanted to turn to Bayu for this because with all this talk about the net zero transition, whether it's for the corporate sector or from the government as well, we know that a key challenge is in attracting private finance for these sustainable projects or ventures. Tell us more about what key challenges you see there and how do we overcome these challenges, whether it's from IIF's point of view, or even with any private or public sector contribution as well?
Well, actually, based on our experience, there is no lack of projects in a sustainable industry. So renewables, mini hydros, solar power, and so on and so forth. But the challenges that we see is basically on the awareness on that any of the projects, all of the projects has to be developed sustainably. So, for example, mini hydro, people will think that mini hydro is good. It will support on the decarbonizations. It will achieve on the net zero target set by the government and so on. But if you do it on a not sustainable way, for example, does not take into account the biodiversity, does not look into the collaboration with the surrounding community and so on and so forth. So that may achieve not as per expected. So meaning that you build a mini hydro, you get the electricity in a clean energy sources, but you do it in the wrong way. So what we do is actually to build the awareness on the industry. So we talk with the other bankers, we talk with the private sectors, we talk with the investors. We open up ourselves or providing the sharing session on how our ESG principles can be applied. So it's actually not a sophisticated kind of method. It's just can be logical. So biodiversity, you just need to do study. If, for example, the study requires a change of the design, then you change the design. So it's not something that is sophisticated that prohibit any investor or any private sector to enter into the projects.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to go to Ratri, because you do, consult and advise clients on all these, climate change investment decisions, strategy as well. What is your point of view in terms of the challenges that they see in putting investments with these projects? And also, what would help to push them along that decision-making process?
Thanks, Meaghan. So I think probably a little bit of a step back about Pollination itself. So we are actually very fortunate that we're active in 3 different pillars or 3 different business units. So we do have our advisory as well, where we work with a lot of corporates and NGOs, governments, project developers as well in their decarbonization and transition strategies. But we're also very fortunate that we've got a project development arm where we do invest off our balance sheet as well in greenfield projects, whether it's in carbon and nature projects as well as renewable energy. And then we've also got an investment arm where we are, that's essentially sort of the asset management part of the business, where we manage third-party capital as well to deploy across a number of transition projects. At the moment, that part of the business is managing about $650 million assets under management, with focus in natural capital as well as carbon projects globally, as well as an emerging climate tech VC. To your question in terms of private capital, I think, as you said, the challenge, particularly in Indonesia, is very big. As you mentioned in the opening speech before, $200 billion a year until 2030 is needed to really fund that climate, that transition to low economy. That equates to about 4.5% of the GDP. The government has, understandably, a lot of priorities, and so there is really a large opportunity of private and blended and concessional capital to sort of crowd into that gap. But obviously, when we start bringing in a private sector investor lens, there are different metrics, risk appetite, desire to seek the path to a large scale of investment, as well as commercial criteria that come into play as well. But opportunities, as you said, for blended finance, i.e. crowding the public resources with private financing, really has the potential to drastically increase and accelerate that investment into emerging markets and developing economies. In Indonesia, we're seeing early successes in these types of models. We see the Indonesian Investment Authority, for example, are promoting and originating these opportunities in what we say are critical growth sectors in Indonesia, where it can leverage of Indonesia's advantage as well, where they look to co-finance with domestic and international capital providers. Actually, recently, Pollination has announced a partnership with INA as well to co-invest and co-develop in nature-based solutions in Indonesia in order to help Indonesia achieve meet its NDC commitments while bringing significant economic, commercial, environmental, biodiversity, and community impact at scale as well.
Thank you for providing that very interesting perspective. I wanted to turn to Jiro for this because we've been holding on how much private sector capital, but also public sector capital is needed to fund these these sustainable projects as well. And just to throw out more numbers here, not only will Indonesia require an average of 200 billion yearly through 2030 to finance its net zero climate goals, but as of 2020, I think the government could only meet 34% of investment that's needed to reach these NDC targets. And the private sector investment was about only $21 billion over the period of 2015 to 2019, which makes up about 9% of what's needed. So to Jiro here, then the question is, how I guess the short-term and long-term challenges is quite apparent, but how can the public and private sector work together to mobilize the capital that's needed to reach Indonesia's net zero goals?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, indeed. I mean, the huge money is needed, and then there are a lot of numbers thrown in, and I think, for example, ADB also had in 2017 or so. I think we had a study on infrastructure needs. It's not necessarily a decarbonization, but infrastructure with the climate sort of issues, incorporated. Developing Asia needed about $26 trillion from 2016 to 2030. That's about $1.7 trillion a year. And then also for Southeast Asia, also $3.1 trillion during the same $3.1 trillion between the same period, or $210 billion per year. And this is about 5 years ago, right? I mean, this is done in 5 years ago. So I mean, right now, probably if you do it, probably it's much bigger, right? And then also you talked about this $200 billion. The message is clear that and then also at the same time, this is not the amount, no way that the public sector institution can finance. Right? So the bulk of the work in the financing side has to come from the private sector. So that's one big sort of probably a consensus that we all agree on. Secondly, but I also at the same time, I see a lot of interest now coming from the private sector. There could be a lot of interest, investors who are waiting and looking at the opportunities to invest the money, the fund, liquidity or financing that they have. And I think the challenge really, the short term and the medium term, is really how to really develop a system that channels this financing available into the sustainable kind of the project and activities that have the sustainable goals. So I think that's probably the area that, of course, the public sector will need to be working on very, very hard. You talked about the risk profile and then also about the risk and return profile, right? I mean, then how can we, in the public sector side, de-risk some of the sort of the challenge that you're facing? And then also in terms of, I think one of the big challenges, practically from our operating side, that we face also is the lack of really the bankable project that really, that addresses the climate issue. Bayu talked about there are a lot of projects, but at the same time, there are not necessarily, if you really look into it, how many of that can actually be bankable and then also financially viable, right? It's a different matter. So I think that also in terms of from our perspective, we could sort of help sort of develop the pipeline of the good bankable project. If you look at the Indonesian situation and specifically, I think it came out pretty clearly in Pak Gigi's presentation as well. The electricity the sector is really important, right? And then to bring electricity generation away from coal is one of the very important sort of the goals that we have. But we can do that by three sort of paths. One is to develop renewable. Second is make investment on the grid and network connecting, right? And then third is the potential early retirement or repurposing of coal-fired power plant, right? I think that there are a lot of interest on the renewable side, from the private sector as well. I think the challenge that we face from the financing, channeling the financing, is in terms of the last two, the grid and then the networking, and then also the early retirement part of thing. One of the areas that from the systematic point of view that we might want to take a look at is, and then that's something that the government of Indonesia is very actively pursuing, is the transition finance taxonomy. Yeah. Right now, if you finance help the coal-fired power early retirement or repurposing, it may be classified as investment into fossil fuel or coal, right? So that would reduce the interest from the financier side in order to help that kind of activity. If the taxonomy can be kind of changed, amended in a way that is also count as green financing, or at least amber, that would possibly unlock some of the financing that is sitting out there. Strengthening of grid is really sometimes is overlooked, but it's really, really important. But at the same time, the revenue side, it is not very high. So this is also something that that we need to work on. But finally, long term, I think it is really important that we need to internalize the externality, and that is about the carbon pricing, and that is about the carbon trading, and that it requires international agreement as well as within the country. Also, a lot of coordination needs to be happening among the policymakers. But at the end of the day, carbon tax, carbon pricing is still a nascent kind of thing for everybody. But I think it would really have a very high potential in order to bring in the sustainable sort of channeling of financing into green investments.
Thank you so much, Jiro. I think you have your work cut out for you here in the next 2 years. The 2024 partnership. I wanted to kind of just, you unpacked a lot of things in just that short amount of time. I know that when you said there was a lack of bankable projects, I looked at Bayu and Bayu was like, do you would like to comment on that? Because I was recently as well at the Jakarta Investment Forum, and there were lots of projects there that seemed that was out for promotion, most of which are sustainable as well, or sustainability based. So Bayu, would you like to comment on that?
Agree that there are a lot of projects, but the one that are well prepared is limited. So basically at our side at Indonesia Infrastructure Finance, we look at the for example, if this is a power plant, we look at the PPA. The PPA has to be there. Second is the permit and licensing, and third is the locations. Now, for a power plant projects, there are two ways. The first one is the on-grid. The second one is the off-grid. On-grid, the big renewables power plant projects are basically non-existent. There are some tender for the floating solar. There are tender for the wind farm. There are existing hydropower plant that is being offered by the PLN. But the one that actually requires a financing is very limited. So we go with the mini hydros. Mini hydros in the remote area, there are some. I think on average in each year we close about 2 to 3 projects. But it's small. If you look at the Pak Gigi target, it's basically meaningless. But on the other hand, is that we keep on looking for the well-prepared projects. We keep on continuing the discussion both with the investor as well as with the PLN. What are the one that is going to be launched and so on. But then again, it's complex. It also PLN also we understand that PLN also need to calculate the demand supply equilibriums, and we understand that there is a issue on the grid. The grid that is already well prepared is in Java, but in Java itself is not yet can absorb renewables, which is typically is not a baseload provider.
Well, thank you, Bayu. I just wanted to take a pause here because we will be having a Q&A session in just a little bit. So if you want to use this QR code just to put in your questions, just so that I can have a look later and deliver it to the speakers, that would be great. But I wanted to go to Ratri for a little bit, actually. In terms of, we're on the topic of bankable, sustainable projects. What are some KPIs, that investors must consider, or for Pollination as well in your, the projects that you have been investing in as well, with respect to the impact of these investments in Indonesia?
Sure. At Pollination, I think probably similar to Ibu Lucita at April as well, we've got, our work is really geared to accelerate the transition across, to solve what we call the twin crisis, to get to net zero and nature positive future. So I think for us, beyond the obvious, for our projects and our investments as well, beyond reaching sort of the net zero commitments, i.e. the greenhouse gas emission reduction, we also look at some other metrics such as, the amount of restoration of peatlands and other ecosystem, the contribution of the of a particular project towards adding to the share of renewable energy in the primary energy mix, creation of green jobs and impact on the community as well, improvement in air quality, and the mobilization ratio on the funding of sustainable investments. Wanted to draw probably one project that we're working on at the moment. It is in Australia, but we've been able to commence a very, very meaningful green hydrogen project in Western Australia, where we're doing it in a very unique partnership with the Indigenous community, having the Indigenous community as a shareholder within the project itself as well. So it's seeing these opportunities, but also with multiple different lenses.
Thank you so much, Ratri. And then with that, I wanted to turn to Lucita, because, the panelists today have also unpacked a lot of elements and factors that goes into a net zero journey, whether it's for corporate, whether it's for investor, whether it's for government as well. How would you characterize April's path to 2030? What kind of milestones are there to look forward to? Any insights, that companies here could also learn from as well?
Sure, but maybe if I could just react a bit to the point about how do we make such sustainability initiatives actually bankable, because it also applies to us even within the company, right? How do we make the business case for it? And as an example, I suppose in 2019, we started piloting with the solar panel, establishing solar power sources within our company as part of the whole decarbonization program and shifting to renewable energy. And at that time, even with a pilot of 1 megawatt, I think the payback period was still at 12 to 13 years. But just recently, because of the oil price situation, this has just been significantly reduced down to 5 to 6 years. And what has that resulted in is that, of course, now we're accelerating our solar power installation. And by this year alone, we're increasing it from 1 to 11 megawatts. And the original target of 25 megawatts by 2030 will be achieved by 2025, and we doubled our target to 2050. So from our perspective, as well as the stewards of the sustainability agenda within the company, we need to know how to make the business case so that we are able to sustain the investment that's coming into our initiative. And not only that, I guess there are also examples that we're familiar with some of the nature-based solutions partnerships that we're talking to. There are many ecosystem restoration concession licenses out there, or conservation initiatives, mostly run by NGOs that do not know how to actually make their initiatives bankable, because historically they've always been just donor funded, which of course does not come with long-term certainty. And so right now, many of them are fledgling, but we know that nature-based solutions are actually a significant pillar of how to mitigate climate change. So we're helping them build their capability to actually then approach this as a business so that they, us by providing either our financing or also our technical and operational capabilities as well. But at the same time, there's that piece that's lacking. And which I guess resonates to the point that there are many initiatives that are actually quite worthwhile and would be quite impactful if only they could actually attract the right investments, right? Now, back to your question on our journey, and that's part of it. In the company, we actually don't refer to it as a journey. We tend to think of it as to romanticize the word for what is essentially hard work. That is how I would just characterize it. It's hard work, it's perseverance, right? So how did it start? Well, the first, of course, critical is you need to have buy-in from the shareholders. That is where the business case comes in. We're fortunate that the shareholder himself is behind our initiative. So that's one. Number two, we need to integrate this, right? So with our operational business planning. So it does not become like an isolated initiative that's driven by the sustainability department. It's not. It's about the business transformation. So it needs to be owned by the business function leaders, and that's basically part of the process, the roadmap internally. So what have been some of the milestones? I mentioned about the solar power and how we've been accelerating that. The second thing is, of course, I mentioned about our fiber productivity target of reaching 50% by 2030. We've gained 13% in the last 3 years, so we're in track. And again, that, as mentioned, why is that significant is because that is how we're holding to our no deforestation commitment, which is again very critical for our climate ambition. And then, of course, in terms of our renewable energy transition, we're now at 82%. So that is, I think, quite, in terms of our overall energy mix for our manufacturing operations, and mostly sourced from renewables. We still have about 18%, 11% coming from coal. So that is basically something that we're still trying so hard to squeeze with our shift to renewable. So that's one thing. One of the challenges right now is bringing the supply chain along. Partnerships, particularly, for example, industrial transport, trucks. We still don't have electrification is an option. We do have 11 electric buses now plying the complex and bringing our employees and the families of our employees to where they need to be within the complex. But in terms of the transport of our fiber logs to the mill, that is still an opportunity for change for us. But there's been it's not easy to make that transition. A lot of the industrial transport companies are still wedded into internal combustion engines. And so I think we're finding that we need to approach partners that do not have that legacy so that they'd be much more aggressive in terms of pursuing this opportunity. So a few other challenges, but definitely on track with many of the targets.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I know that I've got lots of questions here, but I just wanted to put one question out to the speakers here, because we're talking about the just transition. We're talking about how we need to include everyone in this transition as well. But in Indonesia, we know there are also other very pressing social economic issues as well that the government, is also quite pressured to solve as well, while also taking this net zero transition quite seriously. How can Indonesia then meet its climate goals or its net zero targets while addressing these other very pressing social economic issues? Jiro, would you like to take it? And then maybe I'll let Lucita also then address that one.
Well, I think that's really the crux of it, right? I mean, this is the challenge that Indonesia and many other developing countries are actually facing. They want to grow. They have they should grow, right? And they should pursue prosperity. But at the same time, how can we again de-link that process with the sort of exponential increase in the greenhouse gas emission? I don't know. I mean, part of that, if, the technology develops, right? And then you talked about the reducing of the cost of for example, the solar over years, if that is continue to grow, and then that could also, give more, economy-wise, it's going to make more sense to invest more in the sustainable and still grow, right? So I think that is partly the solution, I think, but from the policy tool-wise, I think there could also be some area that I talked about internalizing the externality of the climate cost by putting into the price. Yeah, I mean that we have to pay for the carbon pricing, so that would give a disincentive to people or the entity that emitting more greenhouse gas. Yeah, and I guess also in terms of a little bit more micro kind of policy tools could probably be provided. Some of that is to help in the capacity building, and then also helping the technical assistance on structuring the project, preparing the project that is really bankable and sustainable in all front. And then also giving the capacity building for the sort of local communities and the local governments to be able to identify the opportunity and then develop the project around to de-risk to make sure that the project can both do the climate goods and at the same time mobilize private financing. Yeah. So there is no easy answer. I mean, I think that's really a question that a lot of people in the world are exploring right now. And if we have, if you think of a good answer, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jiro. And Lucy, do you have any input to that as well?
Sure. So, as part of our 2030 development agenda, a pillar is called inclusive progress, which is really focusing on empowering communities, right, and enabling them to transform their lives. So, while also meaningfully engaging in this whole green economy transition that we're doing at this point. One of the targets is actually to eliminate extreme poverty in our local communities up to 50 kilometers from our concession boundaries. So, and this has many interventions. I know it's quite an extension, 50 kilometers, if you imagine that, but you do recognize there are still, about 26 million people in Indonesia that's living below poverty line. So we do need to do our share. So, and the way we do that is, of course, we extend our responsibility beyond our concession boundaries. So the way we're striving to help eliminate extreme poverty in the communities where we operate would involve educational opportunities, health, and livelihood interventions. We also have targets related to women, increasing their engagement within the organization, of course, increasing the share of women within the organization, but at the same time also increasing their participation in some of our community initiatives. Jiro made a big point about capacity building. That is actually, I guess, the key, right? Many communities actually would like to take part, for example, in the carbon market. They do have areas that they would like to conserve. They don't really want to go into agriculture right away. If they can actually conserve a piece of forest within their village, they would rather do that. But then, of course, there's a question of sustainable livelihood. How do they get into that? So capacity building in terms of getting into agroforestry, and then helping them as well actually develop the conservation project. You cannot have a carbon project if you don't have a conservation program in mind. Many are actually doing it the other way around. They declare it as a carbon project, but actually what you need is a management plan on how are you going to manage the forest or the natural resources on the ground. And then you can quantify your biodiversity credits, your carbon credits, or whatever other co-benefits you're able to get. So this is the kind of technical and complex capacity building that we need to provide to the community so that at some point they are able to participate and engage in these processes as well, and of course benefit as well from these opportunities.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that. And with that, I'm going to move on to a couple of questions in this Slido link that all of you have already put in. I've got one from our editorial team member here. We're talking a little bit about the energy transition. And the question here from him is, how can corporate Indonesia begin to decarbonize while PLN has a cap on renewables procurement in place? Does anyone want to? Is there an answer to that? I don't know, Robin. Are you expecting an answer to that? I guess, if anyone want to comment on, how, the energy transition to procuring greater renewable energy for corporates, how can corporates start on that journey? Jiro?
Sorry, how can?
How can corporates start on their decarbonization journey with respect to the energy transition? From energy, yeah. From the energy perspective.
Corporates, yeah.
Probably, yes.
I think in our case, it's really about the shift to renewable energy, right? Number one, of course, is the first part is to do a whole audit to find where efficiencies can still be had, where you can reduce your energy requirement. So that's the first step. The second step is, of course, how much of your energy balance can you shift to renewable energy? So, and that's, I think, what we're doing right now. So biomass, solar is being pursued in a big way. Electrification is also being pursued in a big way, but at the same time, you need to step back because electrification is also, it also depends on the source of energy for the electrification, right? Because if it's still fossil fuel based, then maybe net we don't know what's the impact. So it's a whole slew of initiatives that we're doing right now but the big part of it has to do with first reducing your energy requirement and then two, shifting to renewables as much as you can or wherever you're able to have that opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, myself is from the financing institution, so I mean, aside the electricity and air conditioning, there are not a lot of energy, but we came across with a company. It's an energy service company. So what they do is that they offer to the corporates on how to have a more efficient energy in their facilities. So, for example, the lighting, can they change it to LCD? The air conditioning, the chiller, and so on and so forth. Now, what they said to us is that most of the company they do not realize that they have an opportunity to reduce the cost by reducing the energy consumption. The second is that if they do look at the opportunity, there is not much of banks that can provide financing to that. Basically, it's not the money generating, but it's on the reducing the cost part. So banks typically they do not see it as a opportunity to provide the loan. So what we do is that we try to find a blended financing program. Apparently, Green Climate Fund is working on something with Korean Development Bank that they will provide a guarantee to the loan to this kind of projects, the energy efficiency projects. So I guess that's part of the initiative that can be taken for the ESCO company to goes to the corporate on how to lower the energy consumptions and can secure the financing from the banks.
Thank you so much, Bayu. I know we are running quite short on time, but I'm going to just answer one more question from this poll because I think that it segues quite nicely into the final question. Regarding this just transition, what are the indicators that need to be considered to ensure the just element is internalized in the transition process? Maybe Ratri, if you'd like to go for this one.
Sure, I'll try to answer as best as possible. But I think to Ibu Lucita's point as well, I think a just transition really takes into account the community that you're working with, particularly in the work that we're doing in the Carbon and Nature project development. Without any engagement with the local community and having them as a shareholder as well as a stakeholder, you will not have those projects being successful. The design of benefit sharing mechanism, particularly in carbon and nature projects from very, very early on is super critical. Their involvement in being stewards of these projects are going to be super critical.
And Jiro, do you want to comment very quickly on that one as well?
Oh, okay, thank you. I think, I think just part is very important. But also, I mean, I want to talk about affordable as well, because the government of Indonesia talks a lot about just and affordable. And then making sure that energy transition is affordable for the country and for the people of all, that could actually help in making it just, because then I think that is not going to put the people do not have to bear an overwhelming cost for the transition, so that they would not, for example, if that makes the access to electricity power too expensive for them to do, and that would be a problem. So if, without pricing them out from this particular sort of the transition, to make it affordable. I think that's also a very important part of the thing that we need to think about.
Thank you so much, Jiro. And with that, very nicely, I'm going to end off with a final question to all my panelists here. What is one key takeaway? I know this is a challenging one, but it's one key takeaway or one key action that must be done in order to achieve Indonesia's net zero climate goals? Lucy or Jiro? You're like looking at who should go. Who wants to take this first? Jiro, maybe.
I think really to make energy transition bankable in a sense that it makes sense for the business community and the society to invest in energy transition, to come up with the system that would do that, incentivize that. I think that is really the key for the sustainable sort of keeping momentum going and also achieve that goal at the end of the day. So, yeah.
Jiro. And Ratri?
I think probably boring as well from Pat Jiro. Definitely think it would be very important to start internalizing the price of carbon into the economic and financial sense. We often ignore it for the longest time. But I think with the emerging carbon markets agenda in Indonesia, particularly, the emerging instruments such as, the carbon tax credits and results-based payment, we'll start sort of seeing companies and, government as well internalizing those factors into economic decision making. The carbon exchange is going to be opening soon, and we'll start seeing how emission reduction will be traded and help industry achieve its emissions target. And I think particularly tracking towards that nature positive future and reversing the biodiversity and natural capital loss, it'll be great to sort of see the emergence of things like nature and biodiversity credits as well, where we place a clear value metric against those biodiversity and impact in our economic activities.
Thank you so much, Ratri. And on to you, Bayu.
Yes. Well, I think the keywords that was presented earlier, that was given by the participant earlier, is that it's complex, it's interconnected. It's not just the government's responsibility, it's not just the private sectors, it's not just the development agency actions. So this, I believe, is an evolution to take the climate change as part of our life now. And it is for each and every one of us to be take part of it. So I think I recall one of the saying from a famous preacher in Indonesia that we need to start from ourselves. We need to start from the small things, and we need to start now. So by internalizing that in each and every one of us, the Indonesians, then it will be snowballing and enable us to achieve that target.
And finally, but not least, Lucy.
Thanks, Meaghan. So I think it's important that the sustainability performance is actually really linked to financing and to investments. There are now mechanisms called sustainability-linked loans. We have closed about $1 billion of them a couple of years ago. Every year we're assessed in terms of our performance related to the sustainability-linked loans according to specific KPIs. And that's a way of encouraging more financing, more investments, because we do measure and report, and there's transparency in terms of the sustainability performance. The other thing is, of course, we really need to encourage more investments and nature-based solutions. Ratri mentioned the same thing. Indonesia has a significant opportunity to be a leader both in terms of the carbon and biodiversity credits as they're being discussed right now. And the question is really becoming much more aggressive in terms of opening up these opportunities and encouraging investments into this. Private sector can play a role. We're playing our role, and I think we can demonstrate that for so long as the business case is coming and that financing is encouraged because of the sustainability performance, then many other private sector players are going to come soon as well.
Thank you so much, Lucita, for ending us on that note. And I really wish we had more time. I know that we had a lot more questions in the Slido, but with that, let's thank our speakers for being here today. But just to wrap up with a couple of points, we spoke about many things today, about the importance of private sector investment capital, with the importance of public and private partnerships as well as the just element in this transition to make sure that everyone's included in this journey to net zero. And with that, with the word cloud that all of you participated in, we can all agree that this road road is not going to be easy. It's going to be challenging, complex, but also with that optimistic looking outlook as well. We know that this can be achieved if all the elements that we just spoke about earlier is done and that everyone plays a part. But with that, on that note, thank you everyone for being here. Again, for the panelists too, providing your very, very insightful feedback and opinion as well.